name is Sarah Mancini, and I'm with the Office of Neighborhood Coordination. And I'm here with Adam Hathaway, a professional registered parliamentarian, and he's going to give us an overview on bylaws and how you as neighborhood associations can get the most out of your bylaws. Adam, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, thank you very much for having me.
Would you mind just telling us a little bit about what it means to be a professional registered parliamentarian and what you guys do?
Sure. A parliamentarian is an expert in meeting management and somebody who can help any organization with their parliamentary authority. I specialize in Robert's Rules of Order, and there's also a number of others. Parliamentarians can help you out not only providing services as a parliamentarian, but being a presiding officer and making recommendations regarding amending, creating, and revising bylaws.
Okay, well, which kind of brings us to what we're talking about today. Can you give us an idea of why bylaws are so important?
Bylaws generally provide the basic structure and culture for the organization. Not every organization has a parent organization that provides a guideline and structure. So when you decide to create an organization, you can use the bylaws to determine how it's going to work, who has authority to do what the members' rights and responsibilities are, and a general feel and flavor for the organization itself.
Interesting. I'm sure you've read a lot of associations' bylaws over the years, and I'm wondering what recommendations do you have on how an association can make their bylaws really clear and easy to understand?
So there's a few overarching philosophies that we like to teach, and so the basics ones are say it once, say it in the right place, and say it clearly.
Okay.
We coach people to say it once because sometimes people want to repeat sections. Mm-hmm. There's a fear that no one's going to read the entire set of bylaws. And so if there's something people think is important, then they want to state it several times.
Right.
But the problem is once you do that, you get clarity problems. If you decide to summarize something in your parent organization or summarize a law, once you start summarizing, you start to lose clarity and perhaps create conflicts. And of course, if your parent bylaws change or if there's a section of your bylaws that changes, then if you then aren't aware of that and then don't change your bylaws, you now have a potential conflict.
You keep talking about a parent organization and a parent bylaws. What would that look like for our neighborhood associations? What might be their parent organization?
I think the closest thing that the neighborhood associations might have to a parent organization would be the Office of Neighborhood Coordination. There are certain rules or guidelines that you would have for them, and of course there's always the law. Depending upon what type of organization you have, since there's homeowners associations and there's neighborhood associations, different types of organizations may have different laws or different policies that affect their operations.
Would the Secretary of State's office be an appropriate parent organization if they've incorporated with the state?
Definitely,
Okay.
and those rules would have to be followed, and they would also be an excellent source on how to deal with the concerns that office deals with.
Okay, so back to what you were saying, say it once, and then what were the other two parts to make sure your bylaws are clear?
Say it in the right place. When you decide what should be in your bylaws, or if you're doing a review and you're trying to make sure that everything's as clear as possible, you want to make sure that intuitively people can find what they're looking for. If your members want to know what the dues are, then the most likely place to put those would be under the article entitled membership. Some organizations might put them in strange places like treasurer's duties, but that's not really intuitive.
Oh, that would be confusing.
Indeed.
And then what was the third one?
Say it clearly.
Say it clearly.
If you find that you're using a lot of words or several paragraphs to get a certain point across, and we see this a lot in elections or filling vacancies in office, if you're having to use paragraphs to get your point across and to demonstrate a certain practice, it's probably going to be confusing. A lot of times the fewer words may often be the best.
And it's always harder to write something with fewer words than it is to write it with more, because you have to be very precise and careful with the language and the words that you choose.
Exactly, and one really good example of that is I encourage people in their bylaws, if they want something to occur, they should use words like shall. Elections shall be held the first meeting in May. Officers shall have the following duties. Some organizations either because they don't know or they don't want to use a word as strong as shall. They want a friendlier set. Sometimes they'll use may. And if you use may, it's really not very binding. And so sometimes it creates confusion. Well, do we have to follow this rule or not?
That makes sense. You've kind of touched on this already, but maybe you can go a little bit deeper. What are the sections in bylaws that associations should take extra care with when crafting the language? So I guess what I'm asking is, what are some common places of confusion that you've seen?
One section that I think requires a lot of attention is the section on members or membership. Some organizations have different types of member classes. Well, if there's a certain class that doesn't have voting rights, like maybe they're an honorary class, or they have different rights and responsibilities in the organization, those need to be clearly stated. Also, there's a confusion sometimes with dues. Let's say dues are due January 1st, and you don't pay your dues and it's March. You don't automatically lose any membership rights or voting rights unless it's put in the bylaws that if dues are not paid by a particular time, then you might be expelled or you can't vote or whatever it is. But without a specific clause in the bylaws, no one can lose their right to vote, even if they haven't paid dues in 10, 12, 40 years.
Really?
Indeed. So that brings up another point, Sarah, and that is all duties that an organization has must be delegated to it, and that's one thing the bylaws do, is they delegate authority to the members, to the officers, to a board. And so if something has not been specifically delegated in the bylaws, then that body or that person doesn't have that authority. The old saying, where does it say I can't, doesn't actually apply because everything is permissive. So really it's more like, where does it say I can?
Okay, that makes sense. So really what you're looking for in the bylaws is where it specifically states you have that power, you have that authority, and if it doesn't state it, then your assumption should be that you don't have that power or authority.
Definitely. Another section that requires, I think, a great deal of attention is your section on boards of directors. Because a lot of times organizations will create boards to handle business between meetings. If meetings are only quarterly or meetings are only annual, then you'll create a board who can conduct business, and maybe the business that the average membership doesn't really want to deal with. And so the board can do that. So writing about the board, it's very important to remember, designate the number of people on the board. I would stay away from a range. I would stay away from a board can consist of anywhere between 5 and 15 members or something like that, because it can create confusion of what quorum might be or how some operations occur or even when elections are. So I'd be very specific about the number of members on the board. When are they elected? Do you have some elected on even years and some on odd years? Or do you want to have over 3 or 5 years, a certain percentage of the board elected, so you don't have board turnover all at one time? Be very specific about when board terms begin and end, and very specific about what authority you're giving them. Do they have the ability to make line item transfers? Can they spend money? Can they change bylaws? Which I would say is a bad idea, but some organizations do it. So whatever it is you want the board to be able to do, be very clear, and maybe even specify it in bullets so that it's very clear as to what the powers are.
Wow, so you can have bullet points in your bylaws. I've never seen an association do that, I don't think. Are there any other areas that might need to have particular care when crafting the words?
There's some concern sometimes over quorum. Now, quorum simply means the minimum number of people required to conduct business. So stating what quorum is very important. And if an organization does not state quorum, then Robert's Rules of Order would kick in if that's the parliamentary authority. And Robert says, if your bylaws don't say anything, then your quorum is a majority of the entire membership.
Okay.
Well, if you have a very large organization, let's say 500 people, you're probably not going to get 251 going to a meeting. So you want to make sure you specify what quorum is. It's usually best to use a number. Quorum shall be 15. Quorum shall be 20. Organizations that use percentages sometimes run into account. Well, what's the percentage of quorum if we've had resignations? What's the percentage if the board is 12, but yesterday it was 9. That's that problem we talked about before about having board numbers that flex. So being very specific about quorum, and with a reminder, of course, that quorum must always be maintained during a meeting. So if at any point quorum is lost, the organization can't conduct business until quorum is resumed or the next meeting.
So we're wrapping up here, but one final question for you. Are there any general tips for a neighborhood as they go about either reviewing their bylaws? For some of our associations, I'm sure it's been quite a number of years since they've reviewed their bylaws. Then we also have new associations always creating, and so as they write their bylaws for the first time, any 2 or 3 tips you might have for them to keep in mind?
Absolutely. The first tip I would say in writing or reviewing is write an outline of what points you think should be included in your bylaws. Things that capture the flavor of the neighborhood association and things that will work best for it. And so fortunately there's an outline that exists. There's certain elements that should be in bylaws. And so what I would do is I would simply take those elements and write them in an outline and start writing all of the things. What should dues be? What should members' rights be? What different types of membership types do we have? And so the basic outline of the bylaws is it's a funny little mnemonic called "No Mommy See Pa." and so you take the letters for that, and so what that stands for is your elements of the bylaws. No Mommy See Pa. Name, object, membership, executive board or board of directors.
This is a test. Can you do this?
I sure hope so. Members, officers, committees, parliamentary authority, and amendments.
Okay.
That's that's one thing. So definitely set down that outline. Also, I think organizations should review their bylaws, whether they think they need to or not, about once every 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
Sometimes there's some practices that come into play, and you may want to keep those practices. And if they're not in line with the bylaws, go ahead and change your bylaws.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much, Adam, for joining us today, and we look forward to continue the conversation with you.
Thank you very much.